Stop calling Roy Keane a hard man. That is a lazy label for lazy fans. Vinnie Jones was a hard man. Joey Barton was a thug. If you think Premier League legends were terrified of Roy Keane just because he might tackle them, then you don't understand fear. And you certainly don't understand the psychological warfare of the 1990s. The truth is much darker than a bad tackle. Now picture the scene to understand why. It's the late 90s. The tunnel at Old Trafford is narrow, claustrophobic, and smelling of liniment oil and nervous sweat. You are a professional footballer, an elite athlete at the peak of your physical powers. But as you line up to walk onto the pitch, your heart rate isn't spiking because of the roaring crowd waiting outside. It's spiking because of the man standing just 2 feet away from you. He isn't shouting, he isn't jumping around to warm up. He is just standing there staring straight ahead with eyes that seem to look right through your soul. If you asked a Premier League player from that era about their biggest nightmare, the answer wasn't a career-ending injury. It wasn't relegation. It was Roy Keane. For the casual fan, the fear of Keane is easy to explain superficially. It's the violence. It is the stereotype of a man who treated football less like a sport and more like a gang war. We all know the defining image, April 2001, the Manchester Derby. This was the moment Keane decided to settle a 4-year grudge with Alf Ing Holland. It wasn't a tackle. It was an execution. High studs, full force, right into the knee. As Keane stood over his fallen opponent screaming in his face, the world didn't just see a foul. They saw a monster. In his own autobiography, Keane later admitted chillingly, "I'd waited long enough. I hit him hard. The ball was there, I think. Take that UC asterisk asterisk asterisk." The media labeled him a psycho, a bully, a ticking time bomb. But if we stop there, we miss the point entirely. Here is the paradox. Roy Keane wasn't the biggest man on the pitch. He stood only 5'10". He wasn't the fastest. He certainly wasn't the most skillful compared to wizards like Zidane or Giggs. There were plenty of hard men in football back then, guys who could break your legs without blinking, but people didn't fear them the way they feared Keane. Why? Why did world-class internationals shrink in his presence? Why did opposition teams lose the game in the tunnel before a ball was even kicked? Was it just the fear of getting physically hurt? Or was it a different kind of fear? A psychological terror so intense that it haunts his former teammates to this day. To understand the true horror of the Alpha Devil, we have to go beyond the red cards. We have to listen to the men who were trapped in the dressing room with him. To understand the gravitational pull of Roy Keane's fear, we have to go to the front lines. We have to visit the moment where the hard man myth became a terrifying reality for his rivals. February 1st, 2005, Highbury, Arsenal versus Manchester United. This wasn't just a football match. It was the peak of the greatest rivalry in Premier League history. But the most significant battle that night didn't happen on the grass. It happened inside the narrow concrete tunnel before the teams even walked out. Patrick Vieira, Arsenal's captain, a giant of a man, 6'4", a World Cup winner, decided to intimidate Gary Neville. Vieira was bullying him, shouting at him, trying to break the psychological state of United's right back. Most players would have looked away. Most captains would have waited until they were on the pitch to settle the score. But Roy Keane is not most players. Footage from that night captures the essence of Keane's gravity. He hears the commotion. He sees his teammate being cornered. And like a switch flipping in a machine, the red mist descends. He doesn't just walk over. He charges. He bursts through the referee, Graham Poll, pointing a finger directly into Vieira's face. The audio is legendary. You can hear Keane shouting, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered rage. "We'll see you out there. Shut your mouth, you asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I'll see you out there, asterisk." Think about the psychology of that moment. Vieira was a physical beast, a man who ate midfielders for breakfast. Yet in the face of Keane's exploding temper, the Arsenal captain looked unsettled. Keane wasn't just defending Gary Neville. He was sending a message to every Arsenal player standing in that line. If you want to get to him, you have to go through me. And I am ready to die here tonight. That is the first level of gravity, the protector. Keane's madness made opponents shrink because they knew there was no limit to what he would do to win. But you didn't have to be a rival captain to feel this terror. Sometimes just existing in the same space as Roy Keane was enough to make you want to disappear. Take Peter Crouch, for example. The 6'7" striker, a man who physically towered over Keane, tells a story that perfectly illustrates this aura. Crouch was young, making his way at Liverpool, and during a match he found himself standing near Keane. Crouch recalls, "I remember looking at him and he just stared right through me. It wasn't an angry look, it was worse. It was a look that said, 'You don't belong here.' I honestly wanted the ground to swallow me up." This was the ecosystem of the Premier League in the late 90s and early 2000s. There was a genuine belief among opposition teams that the game was lost before kickoff. Players would stand in the tunnel, look across at the Manchester United line, and see Roy Keane standing at the front, chest out, eyes dead. The psychological weight of his presence was so heavy that by the time the referee blew the whistle, the opposition was already playing for a draw. They weren't playing against 11 men. They were playing against a force of nature. And it wasn't just the players who were afraid. The gravity of Roy Keane warped the authority of the game itself, the referees. We often talk about respect in football, but Keane didn't command respect from officials through politeness. He commanded it through terror. There is a famous image of referee Andy D'Urso backed into a corner, physically leaning away as Keane screams into his face. D'Urso looks like a frightened schoolboy. This was a form of dark power on the pitch. Keane knew that if he could break the referee's confidence, he could control the flow of the game. He could make them hesitate before giving a yellow card to a United player. He could make them think twice before blowing a whistle against his team. It was bullying, yes. But in Keane's mind, it was necessary. It was all part of the war. However, if you think his enemies had it bad, you are mistaken. The opposition only had to deal with Roy Keane for 90 minutes twice a season. They could go home, lock their doors, and forget about him. But there was a group of people who couldn't escape. A group of people who had to face that intensity every single day at breakfast, at training, and in the dressing room. The people who feared Roy Keane the most weren't his enemies. They were his teammates. The dressing room is supposed to be a sanctuary. It is the one place where a footballer can relax, joke with his friends, and escape the pressure of the media and the fans. But at Manchester United under the reign of Roy Keane, the dressing room was not a sanctuary. It was a courtroom. And Roy Keane was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. If opponents feared Keane because he might hurt them physically, his teammates feared him for a reason that was far more terrifying. They were afraid of his standards. To understand the absolute suffocation of this environment, we have to listen to Gerard Piqué. Before he was a Barcelona legend and a World Cup winner, Piqué was just a terrified teenager at Old Trafford. He tells the story of one morning in the dressing room. The team was sitting in silence preparing for a match. Suddenly a sound broke the quiet. Psst, psst. It wasn't even a ringtone. It was just the vibration of a phone left in a pocket. In most clubs, nobody would care. But Piqué froze. He knew he had made a fatal mistake. Piqué recalls what happened next. Roy Keane stood up. He looked around like a predator. He screamed, "Whose phone is that?" Silence. He screamed again, louder, veins popping, "Whose phone is that?" When Piqué finally whispered, "It's mine," Keane didn't just tell him to turn it off. He exploded. He went absolutely mental. Piqué admits he almost wet his pants right there on the bench. Now ask yourself why. Why get so angry over a vibrating phone? It wasn't about the phone, it was about focus. In Keane's world, if your phone is on, your mind is off. And if your mind is off for 1 second, Manchester United loses. He demanded absolute control of the space, no distractions, no excuses. But if you think that was harsh, wait until you hear about Rio Ferdinand's first day. When Rio signed for United in 2002, he was the most expensive defender in British history. He was confident, stylish, and talented. In his first training session, he got the ball, looked up, and played a nice, simple, safe pass sideways to Gary Neville. In any other team, that's a good possession play. But before the ball even reached Neville, Keane was screaming. Rio recalls Keane storming over to him, "We don't do that here, pass it forward, take risks. You're not at Leeds anymore." Rio was shocked. He stood there thinking, what is this guy's problem? But he quickly realized the truth. Keane wasn't angry at Rio, he was angry at the safety. He was angry at the mediocrity of playing it safe. This brings us to the core of the fear. Why were grown men, millionaires, and internationals so terrified of their captain? It wasn't because they thought Keane would punch them in the face, though that was always a possibility. It was because they were terrified of disappointing him. Gary Neville, who played with Keane for over a decade, summed it up perfectly. He said Roy was the barometer. He was the measuring stick. If Roy was happy, you knew you were playing well. If Roy wasn't happy, you knew you weren't good enough. You didn't look at the manager. You looked at Roy. Keane created a culture where good was the enemy of great. If you came into training and gave 90% effort, Keane would destroy you verbally. He would isolate you. He would make you feel like you were the reason the team would fail on Saturday. Darren Fletcher and John O'Shea, who came up through the academy, described training sessions at Carrington as war zones. They said that Tuesday mornings were often harder than Saturday afternoons. Why? Because on Saturday you played against mortal men. On Tuesday you played against Roy Keane. He turned the training pitch into a simulation of extreme pressure. He would smash into tackles. He would berate anyone who lost the ball. He forced the level of intensity so high that by the time match day arrived, the Premier League actually felt slow. This was the gravity of Roy Keane. He didn't just pull you towards him, he pulled you up to his level. And if you couldn't handle the altitude, if you couldn't handle the pressure of the vibrating phone or the forward pass, then you would be crushed. You didn't survive at Manchester United by being talented. You survived by earning the silence of Roy Keane, because when he stopped shouting at you, that was the only time you knew you were finally doing your job. But what happens when the man who demands perfection starts to see flaws in the empire he built? What happens when the leader becomes too dangerous even for the club itself? So we have the monster, the bully, the nightmare. But here is the twist that makes Roy Keane one of the most complex characters in sports history. The psycho wasn't his personality. It was a performance. If you strip away the red kit and the captain's armband, you don't find a raving lunatic. You find a quiet, solitary man. Away from the floodlights, Roy Keane is a classic introvert. He hates the celebrity lifestyle. He despises the noise of fame. For years, his best friend wasn't a fellow footballer. It was his golden retriever, Triggs. There is a famous quote where Keane says, "I don't trust people with big smiles." That isn't the statement of a bully. It is the statement of a man who is deeply guarded. The rage we saw on the pitch, that was a switch he flipped. It was a costume he put on because he believed that Manchester United didn't need a friend. They needed a war general. This brings us to the core of his psychology, the protector. We often focus on the times Keane shouted at his teammates, but we forget the times he bled for them. Look back at the archives. Who was the first person to sprint across the pitch when Gary Neville was being intimidated? Roy Keane. When a young, flashy Cristiano Ronaldo arrived and was being kicked into the air by defenders trying to break his legs, who stepped in to take the revenge tackle? Who took the red card? Roy Keane. The fear he projected was actually a fortress. He made himself the villain of the Premier League so his teammates could play in peace. He absorbed the hatred of the entire world so that the young players in his pack didn't have to. He was the sheepdog who looked like a wolf. But there is a tragedy in this level of perfectionism. When your standards are impossible, eventually everyone falls short, even your friends, even the father figure, Sir Alex Ferguson. The end of Keane's career at Manchester United is the ultimate proof of his core philosophy. It didn't end with a party or a statue. It ended in a brutal, cold office meeting. The infamous MUTV incident where Keane went on club television and ruthlessly criticized his own teammates for a poor performance against Middlesbrough was the breaking point. The club saw it as betrayal. They saw it as toxic. But Keane, in his mind, he wasn't betraying them. He was telling the truth. He looked around the dressing room and saw players relaxing, players accepting defeat, players enjoying their high wages without putting in the work. To a man wired like Keane, that was the ultimate sin. He was sacked not because he stopped caring, but because he cared too much. He chose to be exiled. He chose to lose the only shirt he ever loved rather than lower his standards. He would rather walk away than look a teammate in the eye and say, "That was good enough," when he knew it wasn't. That is the tragedy of the extreme perfectionist. The very fire that forged the greatest dynasty in English football was the same fire that eventually burned him alive. Look at the tunnel cameras in the Premier League today. What do you see? You see players hugging the opposition. You see laughter. You see high fives and handshakes before the battle has even begun. We live in an era where players swap shirts at halftime and apologize to each other on social media after a foul. The game has become cleaner, faster, and more technical, but it has also become friendly. Roy Keane would hate it. When we look back at the career of the Irishman, it is easy to focus on the red cards and the aggression. But the fear that Roy Keane instilled wasn't just about violence. It was about standards. The void left by Keane at Manchester United has never truly been filled. Since he left, we have seen talented players come and go. We have seen world record signings. But we haven't seen that same terrifying demand for perfection. We haven't seen a captain who would rather die on the pitch than accept a draw at home. The fear he created was the fuel that kept the machine running. It was the constant reminder that wearing the shirt was a privilege, not a right. So ultimately, why was everyone so afraid of Roy Keane? Did they fear him because he was brutal? Did they fear him because he was a thug? No. They feared him because he was the ruthless living embodiment of the will to win. He was a mirror that showed you exactly how much you lacked that desire. He represented a level of obsession that most human beings simply cannot handle. It is a quality that modern football is slowly, sadly losing forever.